Open your phone. Pull up a satellite map of almost any American neighborhood built after 1970. Look at it carefully. What do you see? Curving roads that loop back on themselves. Streets that branch like rivers into smaller streams. And at the end of almost every branch, a small circle. A dead end. A street that simply stops. Now find a neighborhood built before World War II. The difference is immediate and almost impossible to explain if you've never thought about it before. Straight lines, right angles, blocks that connect to other blocks, streets that go somewhere. So here is the question that most Americans have never thought to ask. When did the street stop going somewhere? Because it didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because of geography or necessity or the natural shape of the land. It happened because someone made a decision. A very specific decision, rooted in a very specific idea, borrowed from a place most Americans would never think to look. The dead-end street, the cul-de-sac, was not designed by suburban planners trying to create peaceful neighborhoods. It was not invented by developers trying to sell houses. It was not dreamed up in a planning office in New Jersey or California or anywhere in America at all. It was borrowed from military thinking, from the science of how to stop movement, how to trap an enemy, how to make sure that whoever entered a space could not easily leave it. The French military term cul-de-sac translates literally as the bottom of the bag, a passage sealed at one end, a place you enter and cannot exit. In military doctrine, forcing an enemy into a cul-de-sac was a tactical victory. You had them surrounded. They had nowhere to go. Somewhere between the battlefields of Europe and the potato fields of New Jersey, that idea became a neighborhood. And once it did, America built millions of them. The story of how that happened and what it quietly cost the country is the story of one of the most consequential design decisions in American history. A decision most people drive through every single day without ever knowing it was made. Chapter 1. What a street was. 4. Think about the town you grew up in. If you were born before 1960, there is a reasonable chance your childhood neighborhood looked nothing like the subdivisions built after it. There is a reasonable chance you could walk somewhere, not just around the block, somewhere actual, a store, a school, a friend's house 3 streets over, reached by cutting through a connected grid that took you there in a straight line. That was not an accident of history. It was a design philosophy so old and so obvious that no one had ever needed to give it a name. Streets existed to connect people. The great American cities built before the automobile, Philadelphia, Chicago, Savannah, Indianapolis, were organized around grids that distributed movement in every direction. One block led to the next. North connected to south. East connected to west. If one street was crowded, you took another. The system had no single point of failure because it had no hierarchy. Every street was, in principle, as useful as every other. That design solved several problems simultaneously, without anyone sitting down to solve them. A merchant needed customers to reach his store from multiple directions. The grid provided that. A fire wagon needed multiple routes to reach a burning building. The grid provided that too. A child needed to walk to school without crossing a dozen major intersections. The grid, with its short blocks and frequent connections, made that possible. A neighbor needed to reach another neighbor without navigating a labyrinth. The grid made it obvious. Daily life organized itself around streets that went somewhere. The grocery was 3 blocks north. The church was 2 blocks east. The school was 5 blocks in the direction you could see from your front porch. You didn't need to plan a route because the route was self-evident. You walked out your door, and the street told you where to go. And for most of American history, that arrangement was so natural that questioning it would have been like questioning whether roads should have surfaces. Then something happened. Something that changed, not just transportation, but the entire emotional relationship Americans had with their streets. The automobile stopped being a luxury and started becoming ordinary. And suddenly the street that had connected everything began to feel, for the first time, dangerous. That fear genuine, understandable, and completely reasonable, is where the story of the cul-de-sac really begins. Chapter 2. The military origin. Before there were suburban subdivisions, before there were planning commissions or zoning laws or federal housing agencies, there was a medieval English village. And in that village, the street had already learned how to stop. The British term for a short dead-end residential lane is a close. The word has been in use for centuries. And the close was not designed for aesthetics. It was not designed for quiet. It was designed for defense. Medieval English villages used enclosed courtyards and terminated lanes specifically to control the movement of strangers. If someone entered a close, they could not continue through. They had to turn around. They were visible to everyone who lived there. They could not use the residential lane as a shortcut or a through route. The close was a security feature built into the fabric of the neighborhood itself. That defensive logic survived for centuries. It survived into the early 20th century, when a British architect named Raymond Unwin began designing a new kind of community on the outskirts of London. Unwin was one of the founders of the Garden City movement, a British planning philosophy that argued cities had become too crowded, too industrial, too hostile to ordinary human life. The solution, Garden City planners believed, was to build new communities that combined the services of the city with the space and greenery of the countryside. Communities designed around people rather than commerce. Neighborhoods where children could play safely and families could breathe. In 1907, Unwin designed Hampstead Garden suburb in North London. And into that design, he consciously imported the medieval close. Short dead-end residential lanes enclosed the neighborhood's interior. They were explicitly modeled on the defensive village architecture that had existed in England for 1,000 years. Unwin was not being nostalgic. He was being strategic. The close kept strangers out. It reduced through traffic. It gave residents a sense of enclosure and safety that open, connected streets could not provide. 2 years later, in 1909, Unwin published a book called Town Planning in Practice. It became the foundational text of British and American planning theory for the next 3 decades, and in it, Unwin made an argument that seemed almost radical at the time. Not every street needs to connect. Residential streets can terminate. Dead ends are not failures of planning. They are features. That idea crossed the Atlantic, and it arrived at precisely the moment when America needed an answer to a question it had never faced before. How do you build a neighborhood for the age of the automobile? But before we get to that answer, consider what Unwin was actually borrowing. The close had medieval defensive origins. The French military term that gave us the word cul-de-sac described a tactical trap, and the British military engineers who fought in the trenches of World War I had spent 4 years designing elaborate systems of dead-end passages, blind alleys, and terminated routes specifically to trap, slow, and disorient enemy movement. When Raymond Unwin's ideas reached America, they carried all of that history with them. The dead-end street had always been about controlling who moves and who doesn't. The only thing that changed was the enemy. It was no longer soldiers, it was traffic. Chapter 3. Radburn and the Unfinished Revolution. In 1923, 2 American architects sat down to solve a problem that was getting worse every year. Their names were Clarence Stein and Henry Wright. They had both studied the Garden City movement. They had both read Raymond Unwin, and they had both watched American cities struggling, with increasing desperation, to absorb an automobile culture that the streets had never been designed to handle. Children were being killed on streets they had always played on. Pedestrians and fast-moving vehicles were sharing spaces that couldn't safely contain both. Neighborhoods that had been quiet and walkable a decade earlier were now loud, dangerous, and increasingly unpleasant to live in. Stein and Wright believed they had an answer. In 1928, construction began on a new community in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. It was called Radburn. And the people who built it believed they weren't simply building another suburb. They were building the suburb of the future. Radburn introduced ideas that had never been combined in an American community before. Homes faced parks instead of roads. Pedestrian pathways were completely separated from automobile traffic. Large superblocks replaced the small city block. And residential streets terminated rather than connecting through the neighborhood. The logic was elegant. If you live on a street that goes nowhere, only the people who live on that street have any reason to drive on it. Strangers have no reason to enter. Traffic has no reason to pass. The street becomes, in effect, a private lane for the people who live there, quiet, slow, and safe. Children could walk to the Central Park without crossing a single road. Families could move through the interior of the neighborhood entirely on foot. The automobile was accommodated. There were garages, there were access roads, but it was kept at the edges of daily life rather than running through the middle of it. For a moment, it seemed as though someone had actually solved the automobile problem. There was only one thing Stein and Wright did not fully account for. Radburn was supposed to have a train line, a direct transit connection to New York City that would allow residents to travel without depending entirely on their cars. Without that connection, the superblock model, with its terminated streets and separated pedestrian paths, would produce not a community free from car dependence, but a community that could not function without cars at all. The train line was never built. And then, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The City Housing Corporation that funded Radburn went bankrupt. The development was never completed. Of the 25,000 homes originally planned, fewer than 1,000 were built. Radburn failed as a development, but Stein kept writing. He published articles. He gave lectures. He codified Radburn's principles in a 1951 book called Toward New Towns for America. The planning ideas that had gone bankrupt in New Jersey were distributed across the country in print, studied in planning schools, and absorbed into the professional culture of a generation of American planners and subdivision engineers. The project failed. The blueprint survived. And after World War II, when millions of Americans needed homes almost overnight, and developers needed a fast, cheap, replicable model for building them, that blueprint was exactly what the industry was looking for. What happened next was not a planning decision made by any single person or any single agency. It was an avalanche. Chapter 4. The Avalanche. Nobody decided that America would build its suburbs around dead-end streets. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened next. There was no meeting, no legislation, no single moment when planners gathered in a room and voted to terminate the American street grid. Instead, thousands of individual decisions made by thousands of different people, planners, engineers, developers, federal agencies, local governments, all pointed in the same direction simultaneously. And the direction they pointed was away from the grid and toward the cul-de-sac. The federal government went first, without realizing it. The Federal Housing Administration, established in 1934, had been developing underwriting standards that would determine which neighborhoods qualified for government-backed mortgages. FHA appraisers were instructed to favor neighborhoods with limited through traffic. A busy street near a home was considered a risk factor. A quiet residential lane with few passing vehicles was considered a positive indicator. This was not a planning decision. It was a financial one, but its effect on planning was enormous. Developers who wanted buyers to qualify for FHA mortgages, which by the post-war era meant nearly every developer, had a direct financial incentive to build neighborhoods that looked the way FHA appraisers liked them to. Look. Quiet. Separated. Protected from through traffic. The cul-de-sac delivered exactly that. Then the traffic engineers arrived. The Institute of Traffic Engineers published road design standards that organized streets into a rigid hierarchy. Arterial roads carried high volumes of traffic at high speeds. Collector roads gathered traffic from local streets and fed it to arterials. Local streets, residential streets, were explicitly designed to minimize through traffic and serve only the homes that fronted them. The cul-de-sac fit naturally at the bottom of this hierarchy. It was the logical terminal point of a system designed to separate movement by volume and speed. Those standards were adopted by municipalities across America throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Then the economics arrived. Henry Wright had calculated at Radburn that superblock layouts required less pavement per dwelling unit than conventional grids. Fewer intersections, shorter utility runs, less road surface to build and maintain. Developers building at the massive scale of post-war suburbia, thousands of homes at a time, discovered that cul-de-sac street layouts were cheaper to build than grid layouts. The savings were not enormous per house. Multiplied across an entire development, they were significant. And then the subdivision regulations arrived. Local governments across America rewrote their development codes throughout the 1960s. They adopted road width requirements, turning radius standards, and traffic engineering criteria that made traditional grid streets increasingly difficult to build in residential contexts. A grid street, to meet the new standards, often had to be classified as a collector road, which meant it needed to be wider, which meant it carried more traffic, which meant it didn't deliver the quiet residential character that buyers wanted and FHA appraisers rewarded. The regulatory environment didn't mandate the cul-de-sac. It simply made everything else harder. By 1970, the majority of new American suburban development was being built with disconnected street networks, not because of a conspiracy, not because of a single bad decision, but because every incentive in the American planning, financing, and regulatory system pointed toward the dead end. The avalanche had found its valley, and America moved in. Chapter 5. The Hidden Costs. For a decade or two, the quiet streets delivered exactly what they promised. Children rode bicycles in cul-de-sacs without worrying about passing traffic. Neighbors gathered in the shared space at the end of the street. Parents watched from driveways while kids played. The through traffic problem that had made older city streets feel dangerous was gone. The automobile had been tamed. The neighborhood felt safe. Nobody was paying attention to what was happening just outside the neighborhood. Here is the paradox that traffic researchers eventually documented. Disconnected street networks don't reduce the number of vehicle trips. They concentrate them. Every car that leaves a cul-de-sac has only one route out of the subdivision. Every subdivision has only a few connections to the collector road. Every collector road feeds the same arterial, thousands of quiet residential streets, each carrying almost no traffic, emptying simultaneously onto the same 6-lane road at the same time every morning. The neighborhood stayed peaceful. The arterial became a parking lot. That was the first cost. Visible, frustrating, and eventually measured in hours of commuting time lost every year by millions of Americans who lived in the quiet streets and paid for it on the loud ones. The second cost was quieter, and for a long time nobody measured it at all. In 1969, approximately 48% of American children walked or biked to school. By 2009, that number had fallen to 13%. Researchers studying that collapse identified multiple causes, but street connectivity, or rather, the absence of it, was consistently identified as one of the primary factors. Schools built inside disconnected subdivisions were simply unreachable on foot for most children. A school might sit a quarter-mile from a child's home as the crow flies, but if the subdivision had only one exit, and that exit fed onto a 6-lane arterial with no sidewalk, and the school sat on the other side of that arterial behind a parking lot, the quarter-mile became impassable. The child got in the car every day for 12 years of school, and then drove to college, and drove to work, and drove to the grocery store, and drove to the pharmacy. Because the landscape they grew up in had never offered them an alternative, and the landscape they moved to as adults had been built on the same model. Vehicle miles traveled per capita in America increased approximately 300% between 1950 and 2000. Not all of that is the cul-de-sac's fault, but the landscape that required driving for every errand, every school run, every social visit, every grocery trip, that landscape was assembled one dead-end street at a time. The third cost was independence. A child in a disconnected subdivision cannot move freely without an adult driver. This was true in 1965. It remains true today. The teenager who grows up in a cul-de-sac learns, from the first years of their life, that movement requires a car. That freedom and a driver's license are the same thing. That the world beyond the neighborhood is accessible only by vehicle. And then that teenager grows old. The elderly resident who stops driving because of age, because of health, because of the simple passage of time, discovers that the neighborhood designed for their family's quiet years has become a trap. The grocery store that requires a car, the doctor's office that requires a car, the friend 3 subdivisions over who requires a car to visit. The design that promised safety delivered isolation instead. There was a fourth cost that nobody anticipated at all. Fire departments began documenting it in the 1970s. A fire station located 2 miles from a home in a connected grid might reach that home in 4 minutes. The same fire station, the same 2 miles, navigating the looping streets of a disconnected subdivision might take 6 or 7 minutes instead. 1 to 3 minutes. In a house fire, that is not a small number. The quiet streets that protected neighborhoods from strangers also, in some cases, slowed the arrival of the people who needed to get there most urgently. None of these costs were visible when Clarence Stein published his Radburn Principles. None of them were calculated when the FHA wrote its underwriting standards. None of them were anticipated when local governments rewrote their subdivision codes in the 1960s. They accumulated quietly, over decades, while America drove through the same loops and dead ends every morning and called it normal. But in 1961, one writer looked at what was being built and said, plainly and publicly, that it was wrong. Her name was Jane Jacobs. She wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She argued that short blocks, connected streets, and mixed uses were not nostalgic preferences. They were the essential conditions for human community, that the superblock destroyed what it promised to protect. That the quiet street was not an improvement on the connected city, it was an impoverishment of it. The planning establishment largely ignored her for 20 years. And then the numbers started coming in. Chapter 6. The Counterrevolution. In 1981, on a narrow strip of Florida Panhandle between the highway and the Gulf of Mexico, a Cuban-American architect named Andres Duany began building a small beach town called Seaside. It had connected streets, short blocks, homes with front porches facing the road, shops within walking distance of residences, a town center reachable on foot from every house in the development. It looked, in other words, like an American town built before World War II. Duany was not being nostalgic. He was making an argument, not in a book or a lecture or a planning commission meeting, in wood and concrete and asphalt. The argument was that the American suburb had made a wrong turn literally and that the evidence was visible in the landscape itself. That the disconnected streets and isolated subdivisions and car-dependent commercial strips were not inevitable features of modern life, but choices made at specific moments in history that could be unmade. Seaside attracted attention immediately. Some of it was admiring, some of it was mocking. Planning professionals debated whether it was a serious proposal or an elaborate exercise in nostalgia. Critics noted that it was a resort community, not a suburb, and that its lessons might not transfer to the scale of ordinary American development. The debate was productive, and it was spreading. In 1993, Duany and a group of architects and planners formally founded the Congress for the New Urbanism. Their founding charter called explicitly for connected street networks as a non-negotiable foundation of livable community design. They argued for mixed uses, walkable neighborhoods, transit connections, and the kind of street grid that had once been the default for American towns and had been quietly abandoned over the course of a single generation. The federal government began, slowly and partially, to respond. The 1991 Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, a name that obscures its significance, was the first major federal transportation legislation to to fund pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure alongside roads. It was a small acknowledgement, buried in bureaucratic language, that car-only planning had produced costs that were now too large to ignore. Some cities began revising their subdivision regulations, minimum street connectivity ratios, requirements for pedestrian connections between cul-de-sacs and adjacent neighborhoods, bike paths linking dead-end streets to nearby schools and parks. The changes were uneven, often modest, and frequently resisted by developers who had built profitable businesses around the old model. But they were happening. Public health researchers began publishing findings that gave the new urbanists empirical support that ideology alone had not provided. Studies connecting street connectivity to obesity rates, cardiovascular health, childhood development, elderly independence, and mental health outcomes accumulated through the 1990s and 2000s. The argument for connected streets stopped being purely architectural and became medical. Emergency services formalized what their crews had known for years. Fire departments in cities with disconnected suburban street networks documented the response time problem, put numbers to it, and began advocating for connectivity requirements in new development. Even the traffic engineers, the professional class whose road hierarchy standards had done so much to entrench the cul-de-sac, began revisiting their assumptions. Research showing that connected networks could distribute traffic more evenly, reducing peak loads on arterials rather than concentrating them, challenged the assumption that hierarchy was always the superior model. The counter-revolution was real, but it was facing something enormous: 50 years of infrastructure, 50 years of zoning law, 50 years of cultural expectation, millions of houses already built on disconnected streets, millions of families already organize their lives around those streets. A real estate market, a development industry, a regulatory system, and a transportation network, all calibrated to the world the cul-de-sac had made. Changing a landscape takes as long as building it, sometimes longer. Chapter 7. The street outside your door. If you live in a cul-de-sac, or in a subdivision built around them, this documentary has not been an argument against your home. The quiet street has real advantages that are not myths and not marketing. Traffic genuinely is slower. Children genuinely are safer from passing vehicles. The shared space at the end of a dead-end street genuinely does create a kind of neighborhood cohesion, a shared territory, a commons that connected streets don't always produce. The families who chose these neighborhoods were not making a mistake. They were responding rationally to what was offered. But every design involves trade-offs, and the trade-offs of the cul-de-sac were rarely presented alongside its advantages. The quiet residential street came with the congested arterial outside it. The safe place for children to play came with the car that every member of the family needed to reach anywhere else. The peaceful neighborhood came with the child who couldn't walk to school, the teenager who couldn't move freely, the elderly resident who lost independence when they stopped driving. These were not inevitable features of suburban life. They were the specific consequences of a specific design decision, a decision made not in any single moment, but accumulated through decades of planning standards, federal underwriting criteria, engineering manuals, and subdivision regulations, all pointing toward the same dead end. The people who made those decisions were not villains. They were responding to real problems with the tools and knowledge they had. Raymond Unwin was trying to create humane neighborhoods in an age of industrial overcrowding. Clarence Stein was trying to protect children from the automobile. The FHA appraisers who favored quiet streets were trying to protect the value of the mortgages they insured. The traffic engineers who designed the street hierarchy were trying to bring order to cities that felt chaotic. Every one of them was solving a problem. None of them could fully see what their solution was creating. That is how most of history actually works. Not through malice, through accumulation. One decision built on another, each reasonable in isolation, the combined effect visible only in retrospect. If you are over 50, you may be the last generation with a living memory of what American neighborhoods looked like before the cul-de-sac became the default. The corner store, within walking distance. The school you reached on foot. The friend's house 3 streets over, navigated by a child who had never needed an adult to drive them anywhere. The freedom of a connected street that told you, simply by existing, that you were allowed to move through the world on your own terms. That memory is not sentimentality. It is evidence. Evidence that the landscape was built differently once, that the choices were made, that they could, in principle, be made differently again. Some cities are trying. The reconnection of American neighborhoods literally, through new pedestrian paths, new street connections, new subdivision standards is happening in places. Slowly, against significant resistance, but happening. The cul-de-sac will not disappear from America. The infrastructure is too vast, the regulatory inertia too deep, the cultural familiarity too strong. But the conversation about what streets are for who they serve, what they enable, what they prevent, that conversation is louder now than it has been at any point since Clarence Stein stood in a New Jersey field in 1928 and believed he had found the answer. He had found an answer, just not quite the one he thought. The street outside your door is not just pavement. It is a philosophy, a decision about what a neighborhood is for and who it is meant to serve, made decades ago by people responding to problems you may never have known existed, and inherited, without explanation, by everyone who drives into a quiet circle at the end of the day and calls it home. The next time you pull into that circle, you might think about the medieval English village where the design was born, the military engineers who refined it, the architect who brought it to New Jersey, the federal agencies that spread it across a continent. You might think about what the street you're sitting on was designed to stop, and whether, after all this time, you still want it to.